Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to my little YouTube channel. And this is going to be part 2 of my story from the call to adventure to Kundalini awakening, my hero's journey. And if you want to watch part 1, which is kind of an introduction with kind of the first part of my journey when I first started following the call, then I will link that down below. So we left off in the last video with kind of the fourth call coming on, the fourth main call in my life. And that was the call to travel. And we talked about how the call kind of gets stronger each time you follow it. And this is true for me. And I think this is true for a lot of people. When you start to follow that call, it will get stronger. It starts out really faint, but each time you follow it, it kind of builds momentum and energy. And so when I followed that call to travel, it was actually a product of 2 things. One was the call itself got so much stronger than the fear I had felt previously, or that I felt even in the face of going to travel. I felt a lot of fear. And the second thing that contributed to that was the fact that I was really fed up with my current frame. And so each time I followed the other calls, I got a little bit bigger taste of like what was possible in life. And I got a little bit more fed up with the limits of where I found myself. And so when I started doing, for example, when I started doing psychedelics, I got that taste of that feeling of being interconnected with nature and the cosmos. And when I felt that, it actually led to the next call, because I thought to myself, how can I feel that more often? How can I actually access that state of consciousness and that state of being in my regular life? Because I knew that was possible, but I didn't quite know how to get there. And so that led to me starting to do yoga and meditate, because I thought really the only way I'm going to develop my consciousness in that way is if I use those tools every day that are going to get me there. So that's what caused me to start following the call to do the yoga and the meditation. And then as soon as I started doing the yoga and meditation, that led me to get really fed up with the limits even more, and reach toward that next call and listen to that next call, which was to venture out and travel. And so when I made that decision to travel, it felt like a lot of risk involved. And the initial decision to travel wasn't even as big of a risk as some risks I took later on. But in that moment, it felt like a huge risk. I mean, I was only 21, which I see is pretty young now, looking back. And I only had like $90 some in my bank account. And I left alone, right? I didn't really have too much of a plan. I wasn't sure like what was going to happen moving forward. And so when I took that leap, I really took that leap kind of into the unknown. And there was a lot of trust in that call. I really trusted that I was going to be able to keep following that deeper call and that deeper intuition, and that it was going to guide me to the right people and places. And so aside from like the other main ingredients, that I'm sort of talking about, the ingredients of what facilitates this kind of transformational process, right? One of those ingredients is that courage in the face of risk, or that surrender, like a deep surrender to that call that will pull you out into the unknown. So that's one of those alchemical ingredients that facilitates this transformational process we're kind of outlining. Now, did I know this at the moment? Did I really know any of this? No, I didn't. For me, it was just like a serendipitous, almost, Joseph Campbell calls it a serendipitous adventure, when you sort of almost accidentally fall into that hero's journey, and your reality serendipitously, reflects your inner reality. And so part of what's happening when you jump into the unknown is you leave your current frame, you're leaving the normal bounds of society and self behind. And that's where the creative spirit is. The creative spirit is beyond those boundaries. So in a way, you kind of have to break those boundaries in order to access, like I'm saying, this greater mind, and this creative impulse, this true creative impulse or true creative spirit. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. I traveled for probably 6 months or something that first time around, and a lot of different stuff happened. I ended up through about 5 different states. I'm in my car, and I was working my way around the country. And at a certain point, my car breaks down. And so when my car broke down, I went further into that unknown, because I didn't go home and I didn't scramble back to safety. I just kept traveling. So I started hitchhiking. And, just a little side note, like the kind of magic that starts happening when you start hitchhiking, when the more I threw myself into that sort of serendipitous, the more I threw myself into the wind in a way, and I let life gravitate experiences toward me that were right for me, in that state of trust and surrender. Because if you're not in that state, if you're not in an inner aligned state, you might just attract like parts of your shadow and things. And even if you are, sometimes you can attract parts of your shadow. That's part of it. But you start to notice, especially hitchhiking, and I think a lot of people who've hitchhiked and thrown themselves out there like this, you start to notice how your outer reality just like comes to meet your inner reality. And the more aligned you are from within, the more you attract the experiences, the people, the places, the things that match that, and that are there to actually, help you further along on your journey. So I started experiencing this pretty early on, and especially once I started hitchhiking, because I was really just, at the whim of that inner and outer relationship and the synchronicities that came out of that. And so not too long after that, I ended up in a tree sitting community up in Oregon. And again, it was just like meeting somebody, feeling that inspiration, feeling that call, hearing about this place, and then just showing up there. I hitchhiked out there with my backpack, and I ended up in this tree sitting community, building tree sits, climbing up in the trees, doing ground support, and basically living in the woods in community. I ended up out there for about 3 to 4 months, and ended up building this tree sit in one of the trees, and setting lines and climbing like 150 feet up in these trees. And one of the things we did in that community is everybody had a nickname. We picked nicknames, and part of that was because it's like not really a legal activity, you're on private corporate land. And so you didn't, it was kind of like it was kind of like a protection mechanism. But I think it was also just like, I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. It was just sort of an initiation into that experience. So when I changed my name, and again, this is very serendipitous. Like it wasn't something I had planned to do, and it wasn't something I really thought very hard about. It just felt right. And so when I changed my name, I went from an E sound to an ah sound. And that really started to change my reality. When I did that, I actually noticed that my reality, the types of people I attracted, and how I felt, and the sort of inner experiences I was creating were changing too. And, I think the whole name change thing is something that happens in certain traditional initiations as well. It also happens in cults. So This sounds kind of cult-like, but I was on a very independent adventure. It was not, I never felt like I was, being initiated into a cult or anything like that, but it does kind of sound like that. So all this time, no matter where I am, I'm practicing the yoga and meditating every single day. And I started to traverse some really interesting inner territory, some really exalted states, like universal love and just like that feeling of inner divinity. I started to traverse those states more often in my meditations. But one thing that really started to happen as well is that I started to reach that state. Well, actually, it was like this inner kind of visceral cloud that I later realized was like my pain body, or like I've been talking about this whole time, the unconscious mind. So at a certain point with meditation, you're gonna really sink into your shadow. You can reach these exalted states too. If you try to reach the exalted states without dealing with your shit, that's where you get these like, spiritual materialism and spiritual ego, and where someone's like fragmented and split from their shadow even more through their spiritual experiences. So generally, when you start meditating and you start traversing these exalted states, it's important that at some point you're going to be digesting and interacting with your shadow and your unconscious material. I mean, that's the point, really, right? Because you integrate that. That's what awakening is integrating that into the awake mind, into the conscious mind. So I'm having these meditations daily, and this whole time that I'm traveling, this energy is just building. And I think of this as a Kundalini energy. I really do. I think of this as like an internal alchemy was happening. And it was from the moment I followed that first call till the awakening happened, there were every ingredient added to that alchemy, right? And so part of that alchemy was, like I said, the jumping into the unknown, right? The unknown outer territory and the unknown inner territory. It's a reflective experience. The alchemy of, risk and the frequencies, the exalted frequencies of trust and surrender in the heart. The yoga, the meditation, the fasting. I started fasting when I started practicing yoga. There's these key ingredients, the name change, and the following of the call in general, right? So the whole experience has this alchemy, and that the energy of that just kept building and building and building. The more I traveled and the more I added to that. And I could feel that happening. I could feel that I was getting nearer to the experience that I was seeking, which was this awakening experience, right? So right around that time, when I started having those meditations where I started sort of feeling my unconscious mind and my inner kind of visceral pain body or whatever, I met up with what I call the soul ally. And in the myth of the hero's journey, they describe this ally usually comes as like a spirit guide, or in the way that I'm talking about these greater archetypes and templates, right? Your guide could come in the form of like a bodhisattva, like the template of a bodhisattva, or an angel or a spirit guide. In the Native American traditions, I think it can come through an animal. So it can come through in a lot of different ways. But for me, it came through in the form of a human man. And he showed up. I had been at that point traveling in an RV, and we were in Oregon, like I said, and he had traveled on his bicycle all the way from Colorado to Oregon, which is quite a feat, especially because he was on a 1-speed. He was on like an antique bike. And so here's this like really incredible human standing in front of me. And I knew within 24 hours that he embodied something that I was looking for. So I was looking for the state of consciousness, right? I was everything I did was to create this inner alchemy, to birth myself into this new state of being. And when I met him, I realized pretty quick that he had already reached that to some degree. So you could say that he was like a teacher for me, or even almost like a guru. And that is really how I saw him at first. I really saw him. I almost even put him on a pedestal at first, which I don't recommend, but I was very young and naive at that point. But so we start having these really dialed in conversations right away, and we're meditating together, we're praying together, we're setting intentions together, as time went on. But right in the beginning, we're having these really dialed in conversations, and he could really see me. And it's so important on your path to call people in who can see you, at least one person, whether it's a coach or an ally or a friend or a family member, or it's so important to have somebody along the way, especially in those critical moments when you're in a transitional place, when you're in a transformational place, or when you're seeking that transformation, to have somebody that can actually see your circuitry. And he could see my circuitry. He could see it on the level of like my behavior and how my behaviors were wired into that inner unconscious mind and that inner shadow self. And he could also see it in terms of like my potential spiritually. So he understood what I was reaching for, and he could see pretty clearly where I was. And so he started pointing to that for me. And there was a part of me that was like really pissed off and like, annoyed by it. It's like, who is this dude to be, pointing to these parts of me that make me feel insecure or whatever. But it felt so right, because it was really helping me grow and evolve towards that state of being that I wanted to be in more often. And so we're having these really dialed in conversations, and again, this continues to build this energy. So when I look back, it's like from the moment I followed that first call, this energy is slowly building. Each time the new thing comes, that energy keeps building. And he was part of that. The alchemy between us in our conversations, the alchemy between, we both had a template, right? That exists within that greater mind. And they clicked together, and it up-leveled both of us into that next, through that next threshold. So anyway, we're like living in the woods. It's winter's coming on. It's October, November. It's starting to get cold. And he just comes up to me out of the blue one day, and he just points this dot on the map. And he's like, I'm going to go here. I'm going to ride my bike, basically out into the woods, whatever, out to this spot. And it wasn't like a topographical map. It wasn't like a detailed map. We're talking like a fold out tourist map, so it's not like we were like super prepared and picking this spot or anything like that. But I said the most full being yes that I had ever felt. And that yes, I call this the alchemy of the yes moment. That yes combined with the risk taking and the jumping into the unknown and the surrender and the trust, that just by itself is a really beautiful state of alchemy that one can create. So through trust and through surrender and through saying yes to the call, a full yes, you're actually opening yourself up into that greater potential, that greater mind, that greater experience. And a lot of energy within you is going to move and free up within that and get behind that. And when you say a yes, a really big yes like that to a deeper call, those inner boundaries start to dissolve. So your inner boundaries between what's conscious and what's unconscious, or the inner boundaries that you keep surrounded around your ego to keep you feeling safe and all that, those are going to start to get a little bit loose and flimsy. And so within that, you're already starting to kind of melt a little bit. That's the right word. So, and one of the reasons it was kind of like a bit of a bigger risk for me is because I only had a bike. I had a mountain bike with 3 gears. I didn't really have a fully working bike. I did not have a trailer or panniers to put on my bike. I barely had any like rain gear or gear at all to speak of. I had the minimal camping gear. I had been fasting for 2 days leading up to that. So I've been experimenting with fasting since I was, since I started doing yoga, since I was about 17, 18, but I had been fasting for 2 days when he approached me. I had, I think, $7 in my pocket. So no plan, no money, no, barely any gear. And so I just said yes. And I jumped on my bike with this backpack. I had a backpack, so that was cool. But have you ever tried to ride a bike with a backpack like filled with gear on your back? It was not comfortable. Like I was not choosing my reality and my path based on comfort at all. I was choosing it based on this call. And that call was so freaking clear by that point. It wasn't that clear in the beginning. So we ride off into the rain. It's like 45, 50 degrees out. It's raining like sideways. The wind is blowing. And we ride off into the woods towards the coast. And so we end up spending another 2 days. We ditched our bikes. We rode out to the coast and we rode up into the forest. We ditched our bikes and we ended up another couple days hiking through the forest alone, just the 2 of us, and also still fasting. So we're still fasting, we're still praying, we're still meditating. The moon's getting fuller. And we noticed on that hike, on that 2 days that we were in the forest, that we really started shifting consciousness. Not only were we shifting into a different state of being, but our environment felt like it was reflecting that. So we actually felt like we were kind of entering a different dimension of Earth. So we hiked for a couple days, and then we kind of hike out of the woods. I mean, we're still in the woods, but we end up in this clearing that's really a little park, but there was no one there. It's, like I said, it's getting cold, it's getting winter. There's not really a lot of like tourists or like people around. But we end up on this cliff face, and the ocean is just crashing against these cliffs, and the moon is full, and we were still feeling ourselves like elevate. We kept feeling ourselves elevate, elevate, and elevate. By the time we sat down and set up our little tarp or camp on that cliff face, that elevated energy was really strong. And so then we really started to notice, like, what is going on? Like, we're in a different dimension of Earth right now. And everything was super luminous. And when I say super luminous, everything looks super luminous under a full moon. Everything looks super luminous when you have the ocean right next to you. All those negative ions combined with the full moon, that is super luminous in and of itself. But this was a whole nother level of super luminous. Everything looked and felt like it was made out of light. Like we could feel that, and we could feel that within ourselves as well. And so this extremely exalted, interconnected state or dimension of experience started to come over us. And at some point we lay down to go to sleep. We get in our sleeping bags, and we're laying there with our eyes closed, and that energy built up to the point where a vision started to come on. So when I'm talking about this Kundalini energy, and this inner alchemy, the alchemy of these ingredients and the way this energy builds and spreads, it will come up to, it'll fuse into a certain kind of energy and break through into, your visionary, your crown and your visionary space. And that's when you get that window into the greater mind, the greater mind space. You get that. And that window is it's a symbolic information. So when you're reading the signals directly, that information is intuitive. You get that through extrasensory feeling. But when you're reading it from here, it comes in through symbol, right? And it comes in through interacting with these greater archetypes and templates directly. And you can see the visual representation of those morphogenetic field frequencies and stuff like that. And so this vision starts to come on. And the thing about your visionary space is that it's part of you. Anything you experience here, you are connected to. You're not going to go anywhere or see anything that's not part of you. But when I had this awakening and this rebirth experience, it was very clear that what I was seeing through my inner window, my inner visionary window, was happening to me. And so at a certain point, he just like whispers, he's like, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And so we were actually having a telepathic vision. We had a shared vision, which was the same vision. He drew it later. And it was exactly what I had seen. And it was a representation, obviously you can't draw the whole thing because it's like morphing and changing and flowing and kaleidoscoping in your view. And so what the vision was it was a vision of the child reborn. And the child was reborn of the fusion of the 5 elements. So it had all the 5 elements, and Earth was sort of the center of this mandala. And it was this living mandala of symbols. Earth was at the center, and the child was being reborn in the middle. And all these years, as this is happening, it's happening to me. I am being reborn as I'm watching this child be reborn in this symbolic way through my visionary mind space. And, I liken it to the DMT experience, because when you're in a DMT vision, if you can stay anchored, if you don't go, sometimes they call it going past the membrane or something like that, but you can actually reach the totality and still stay anchored in your experience to some degree, as a witness, as an observer. And so, in the beginnings of that, at some point it's like, boom, you're freaking out there. But your awareness can still be conscious, but your ego is gone. But in the beginnings of those DMT experiences, you can stay connected to the internal, intuitive, extrasensory, energetic experience that it is. And you can see that it's connected to what you're seeing. So you're getting symbolic information based on what your body or energy systems are going through. And that's what it felt like. It felt like that layer of sort of a DMT journey. And so I could feel it in my body. I could feel it through my neurophysiology, and I could feel myself going through this Kundalini awakening, or this rebirth experience through this inner alchemy. So I was the child, I was the baby being reborn, and I was seeing it. And so that experience too, that template exists. So the path is already there, I guess is what I'm saying. And for that death and rebirth process, and that, in Christianity, they call it, they talk about being reborn, right? This idea of dying and being reborn exists through many traditions, and that the baptism, the idea of the baptism, right? The idea of pushing yourself into sort of a near-death experience, or creating an alchemy that gets you close enough to that, gets your ego close enough to that, that it will release that DMT, or it'll create that death and rebirth experience. And so in Taoism, they talk about how you actually develop your soul and spirit bodies, right? And you do that through the fusion of these internal elemental forces. So you work with these internal energies and elemental forces, and that gives birth to your spiritual self. And there's a lot of different practices and ways to do that, but one main way is that you've got to transmute. You've got to start to transmute your emotional energies, and transmute the emotional energies stored in different organs through the heart. And so I think of that when I remember this vision. I think of that, you know, basically dying of the ego and the false self and being reborn of the spirit. So anyway, so after that, I had about 3 months of pure bliss, like universal love, like feeling completely interconnected with everyone and everything around me. And we traveled for those 3 months. We kept traveling. We were on our bikes for a little bit. And then we jumped in with a relative of his, and we were actually in a car for a little bit. But we were camping and living outside the whole time, for the most part, with some little blips here and there of other things going on. And for the most part, I was completely absorbed in this greater matrix of universal love. I was aware of that and embodying that at all times. But, you know, much like the psychedelic experience or any peak awakening experience, you know, you're not going to be able to maintain that unless you've fully transmuted all the denser material that could interfere with that awareness. And so about 3 months into that, even with the practice every day and the meditations, and I started to have flashbacks of my childhood trauma. And the first few were actually, I could face those because, I don't know, I was in a really equipped state to do it. But after about 3 months, it got harder to maintain that exalted state as my shadow was becoming more and more prevalent. So after about 3 months, I had about 3 months of really intense shadow work, and to the point where I actually thought I was going crazy. And I was in a sort of like perpetual psychological breakdown. There were so many emotional energies moving, and I couldn't really see anything outside my own triggers and my own shadow. But I could see that that's all I could see. So that's what made it so painful. When you're just in your shadow and it's repressed and you're only seeing it as a projection, you're unconscious of how much pain you're in, and you're unconscious of how confused you are, and you're unconscious of how lost you might be. So I birthed that spiritual awareness, and then I had to go back through my shadow. And so I had enough awareness to realize how confused and how much pain I was in, as I was just like lost in the shadow stuff. But I wasn't lost. I thought I was. I was actually being shown a way to integrate this material. And so over the first 3 months were the hardest. And I was shown from the inside out, like from the emotional to the psychological to the cellular, even over the next few years, how to work with and integrate this shadow material into that exalted consciousness, or into the awakened mind. And it was during my darkest moments of my darkest hour of my entire life, like the darkest hour. And I've had some dark moments, but when I thought, you know, I was probably going nuts and I was having this psychological breakdown or this spiritual breakdown, this dark night, and that I didn't have a lot of support. And so it was from within that moment that this soul mission birthed. And I knew that I was going to actually play that role for others later in life, that I was going to be a guiding light for others who find themselves at some juncture of that experience, that transformational process, that death and rebirth, whether it's to facilitate it or to offer support when you're kind of in the thick of it, because it can get quite scary and intense, depending on how much, you know, unconscious inner material you're carrying into that. And I went into it really naively. And so now I understand like every freaking in and out of that, you know, that process, that transformational process, and how to go through it safely. And anyway, so I birthed that from within that darkest moment. And then after about 3 months, we headed back out on our bikes. And so we ended up on our bicycles, either hitchhiking or biking, living in the woods or the deserts or the rainforests for about 3.5 years total. So that adventure just continued. And there was a lot to that, like a lot of different guidance came through for me in how to continue to integrate the overall rebirth and integrate that inner material. And let's see. So then after that, I end up, I mean, we traveled, I think 7 states. I traveled thousands of miles on my bicycle. I traveled across the state of Arizona while fasting, which I also wouldn't recommend. Maybe I needed a lot of intensity in my life, because there was still that part of me that really needed to channel, because I had grown up with so much intensity. But I had more other smaller ego deaths along the way. And that trip across Arizona was one of those moments. But I continued to build and integrate and build like a wisdom around, you know, how the human can break free, can truly break free from the normal boundaries that we're taught and of our existence, and also bring that back. So then after that bike journey, that was like a really long kind of integration. I really started to land after that. And I still traveled. I went to like 6 different countries. I ended up in Hawaii for a while. And I spent that time then, you know, taking my experience and then developing the skill sets I was going to need, like embodying the skill sets, learning the skills, and realizing some of my skills, like turning my empathy into more of an extrasensory ability. That was one thing. And so I don't really need to go into a ton of detail with that, but that's that process of, you know, once you access something like this, a peak experience, then taking that potential that gave you, that latent potential that these teachers are talking about, and bringing it into tangible form. So for me, that took another 15 years of integration and learning to embody these skill sets and learning new skills. And until about 3 years ago, I sat down and started creating Revolutionary Being. And these are kind of some of the first moments, like you're witnessing me in actually bringing that fully into tangible form and putting words to it and actually transmitting it to others and trying to convey like what it actually is and everything. And yeah, so that's my spiel. That's my story. I probably missed a lot, but you know, it's a learning process. So incredibly grateful for anyone who is willing to witness me in this and share in this beautiful story, you know, all of our beautiful stories of life. And hopefully my story can inspire a similar process in others, so that we can all break free and become creators and sovereign beings, and live a happy and fruitful life, you know, actually be in joy from day to day. So thank you so much. Please hit the like button, subscribe, yada, yada, yada. Come find me on my website. Find me on Facebook at Kaya Marie. I'll put all the links down below. Sending so much love to all of you. Mwah.